Sticking with basketball, the NBA playoffs are taking place, and while we're not going to break that down in full here because we're not really an NBA show, that is going to be saved for Basketball U, which we're hoping to debut at the end of the month, right before the start of the NBA Finals. But there's a series happening right now in the conference quarterfinals with the Suns and the Nuggets. The Nuggets are a very good team. They have one of the best players, if not the best player in the NBA, and Nikola Jokic on their team. The Suns obviously have Kevin Durant, Devin Booker, Chris Paul, and they have had some history in this series. And the history stems from last season and I believe the season before. There has been a lot of fan fighting, and I think there's been a little chippiness with these teams. There was an incident the other night between Nikola Jokic and a fan, and that fan happened to be Suns owner Mat Ishbia. Jokic basically shoved the guy. And when you look at it on tape, Jokic doesn't seem to do it on purpose. But again, putting your hands on a fan, ever since the Malice in the Palace, that has been a very, very taboo subject. The NBA does not want anything to do with that. Honestly, no sports league wants anything to do with that because it's just a bad look. And Mat Ishbia being the owner, he's going to be front and center. He just bought the team not that long ago, trades for Kevin Durant. He's got a lot on the line. He's put a lot of money into this, and he wants to win. He wants to be an owner that is successful right out the gate because there is no guarantee of success when you're the owner of a team. There just isn't. And Mat Ishbia is very, very fired up. Nikola Jokic putting his hands on him, it seemed to me that he wasn't sure who that was. And honestly, how many players can pick out all the owners in a lineup of all the NBA teams? And he's one of the newer owners. He's not some guy that's been there forever. This would be a little bit different if it was some other owner that's been very, very vocal. Mark Cuban, for instance, or James Dolan or somebody like that. To me, there's not a lot of familiarity with the owners in the NBA. So maybe Nikola Jokic didn't know who it was, felt some hands on him and thought it was a fan and said, hey, don't touch me. I think that NBA players have every obligation and right to be able to say that to fans. No matter how you feel about the team and no matter how you feel about the game that is taking place, just because you bought a ticket does not mean that you can do whatever you want at the game. If we were to do that at somebody else's job, it would be considered assault. We can't do that at these games. And while the NBA isn't going to suspend Nikola Jokic, she's going to get fined, I think that that's the right thing to do. But earlier, or at least a couple episodes ago, I talked about Draymond Green. The NBA suspends that guy. That has to be a body of work thing. Nikola Jokic is obviously one of the faces of the league. He almost was a 3-time MVP, a three-peat MVP. And honestly, I think that they just don't want that kind of publicity. And it's funny how they took the stance of, well, these games are too important to suspend this guy. But they did it to Draymond. I understand that Draymond is an instigator. I understand that he has a lot of history with the league. But at the end of the day, be consistent. I just don't think that they're being consistent here because Jokic put his hands on a fan. He put his hands on an owner. And while maybe it wasn't ill-intended, and while maybe it was an honest mistake, he still put his hands on the owner of an NBA franchise. How does that not warrant a suspension? But Draymond does. There are consistency issues here with discipline. That's all that I want to see. I want to see the NBA dole out justice the right way during the NBA playoffs. It's either all or nothing to me. And I think that you have to decide how important are these games and how important is it that we make sure that we're consistent in how we are doling out justice. Nikola Jokic deserves to have been suspended to me because Draymond got suspended. They're not that different. I understand that one of them seems malicious and the other one doesn't. He put his hands on a fan. How is that not a finable and suspendable offense? Just because it's Game 5, just because the Nuggets are the number 1 seed doesn't mean anything. If that is not something that you're concerned about with Draymond, then I don't understand how you're concerned about it here. It just seems very, very hypocritical by the NBA on this. Now, Jokic did not win the MVP this year, and there was a big hubbub about a month ago with Kendrick Perkins talking about the fact that the MVP voting was racist and that race came into play when it came to the MVP. And while we're not going to really dive into that, I just want to talk about this for a second because I think that when it comes to value, everybody sees that differently. When I look at Nikola Jokic, to me, he is doing something in the NBA that we haven't seen for a very, very long time. He is separating himself as one of the greatest big men of all time. He's not quite there yet because he's got to win championships to make that happen. But what he does, the way that his game looks and the way that he looks is revolutionary. He is not Giannis. He is the anti-Giannis, but he's got that kind of talent. And the other guys that were up for discussion are obviously very, very talented in their own right. Joel Embiid has been a force in the NBA for years, part of Trust the Process. He's excellent. He's an alien, a guy who is that tall who can do all the things that he can do. He is amazing, and he was definitely the cornerstone, the rock of the Sixers this year. and they're on the verge of potentially beating the Boston Celtics to make it to the Eastern Conference Finals, finally doing something with all this talent that they have. But when I think of value, I think about where are these guys in the biggest games? I know a lot of people want to compare, well, when did Joel Embiid play Nikola Jokic and how did those results go? It's not about that. Those one-on-one matchups, while somewhat telling in terms of how did they do against each other, it's a body of work. What is value? Where would the Nuggets be without Nikola Jokic? Nowhere. Where would the 76ers be without Joel Embiid? They might still actually be in the playoffs. If you're not an NBA person, but you know who Nikola Jokic is, please name another Denver Nugget for me. I honestly can't. I know that they have another very talented guard, but I'm saying Nikola Jokic is that team. Joel Embiid is not that team. And while James Harden maybe isn't the same guy that he was 5 years ago, he's still capable of an MVP effort. There is still a lot of talent on that Sixers team. So it's a little bit different to me. I don't think race has anything to do with it. I think it has to do with which guy is the most valuable to their team. And a lot of times that has to do with how much of a correlation is their presence and play on the team to their actual winning. And I know that you can be an MVP and be valuable to a losing team because you had such a great season. But in terms of this particular debate, which guy is more valuable? I really don't think it has anything to do with the color of their skin. There are a lot of issues in the NBA and in this entire world where race does come into play. People do use the way that somebody looks to make decisions, and that should never be allowed. I will never stand behind that. But when it comes to something honestly so trivial as the MVP voting, I'm just not sure how Kendrick Perkins is allowed to be able to say these things. And I think it's not even a Kendrick Perkins problem. He's not a great guy on ESPN. I don't find it to be particularly insightful, but it really speaks to the paradigm of television now, where we are paying people to have the worst possible take on television. And Kendrick Perkins and JJ Redick and guys like that, they're prime examples of this. ESPN hires a lot of these guys, and they say these things to be able to get sensationalist clicks and get you talking about this, and maybe it's working because we're talking about it here. But it's absurd. It's absolutely absurd. And while Jokic maybe doesn't look like Joel Embiid, and maybe doesn't play like Joel Embiid, there's no denying that he is really, really great. And there's no denying that he is the reason the Nuggets are where they are. And they actually could move on to the next round and be in the conference finals. That's one thing that we always do. When a guy is really, really good coming into the league, we start asking, when's he going to win the big game? How come he can't win the big one? I mean, think about it. We're still doing this with Giannis. This year, Giannis was asked if this season was a failure. They just won the NBA title 2 seasons ago. Nikola Jokic hasn't won anything yet. He's on the verge of getting there. He's taking those steps with that team. And it's because of him. His play is so integral to that team being successful. I truly believe that he's more valuable to his team than Joel Embiid. And if you're looking at it apples to apples, stats to stats, Joel Embiid had a better statistical year than Nikola Jokic did, but I don't think he's nearly as valuable to his team because there have been samples where Joel Embiid is not in the lineups, particularly in the playoffs, and the Sixers have been better. They've actually won. I think that's an indictment on your value. Joel Embiid is incredibly valuable, don't get me wrong. But if you're talking about comparing him to another guy, no matter if it's white, brown, black, purple, red, I don't care what they look like. It's about value. And I think that Kendrick Perkins and ESPN missed the mark in that particular conversation. And while I congratulate Joel Embiid on winning the MVP, to me, I think that Jokic is doing something that Embiid is not doing. He's revolutionizing the way that that particular position is played. And maybe he started it. I don't know. But Jokic is doing it so well, the passing, the shooting, the point scoring. It's amazing. And he looks like my dad's friend, Carl. I've never seen a player look like that and be so good. And it just amazes me. So Nikola Jokic, I think, has a very, very bright future. I do think he should have been suspended in this case. It is what it is. We will check in on the NBA playoffs a little bit later this month.